In 1994 in April, I was at the United Nations. I was completing my third book, which was a history of the organisation for its 50th anniversary in 1995. So I was outside the Security Council. I'd also studied the history of peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, so I had closely looked at the role of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, that was here. So my investigation began at the Security Council. I interviewed two key ambassadors who were in the council at the time. Colin Keating, the president of the council in '94, the ambassador for New Zealand, and Ambassador Karel Kovanda from the Czech Republic. Interestingly, his parents were survivors of the Holocaust in Europe. These two ambassadors who sat in the council meetings, the secret meetings, day after day to discuss what was happening here, had tried absolutely everything they could to get the council to recognise that genocide was happening here in April. And as I expect you know from my first book, A People Betrayed, the UK and the US resisted the use of the words at all costs. And I found that utterly shameful. I still do so today. So my first investigation was how the council had operated in secret when the genocide against the Tutsi was actually happening.
Now, what is really interesting is that internationally, a lot in the media, a lot of the commentators, a lot of academics frame what happened in Rwanda in 1994, in that the world was distracted, the world did not know what was going on. But actually, from your first book, and also a lot of information that's come out since, everybody knew what was going on within the Security Council, so much so that, as you point out, they were too busy trying to make sure that it wasn't called what it was.
I think the council was distracted in 1994. The entire focus was on former Yugoslavia, the civil war there. The council had provided 70,000 peacekeepers for former Yugoslavia, and every day the council meeting started with discussing former Yugoslavia. So for a start, Rwanda was way down the agenda. Now, the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide is a treaty. It's not optional whether you actually abide by it if you've signed it. It is an obligation, and it was quite clear even then that they were turning their backs on the convention. And I found this scandalous, particularly on behalf of the US and the UK, who had the information and yet chose to ignore it.
And of course, more than that, they also are looking not only just to ignore the information, but to actually withdraw what troops of the UN that they were in Rwanda, so that it becomes something completely of which they knew nothing really.
Yes, on April the 21st, the Security Council voted to withdraw the bulk of the peacekeepers. They allowed Lieutenant General Dallaire to stay behind with some 250 peacekeepers, as the UK ambassador said, to try to reach a ceasefire. There was absolutely no talk at the time of saving civilians, and that too, I think, is particularly scandalous. In fact, General Dallaire disobeyed the council order and 450 UN peacekeepers remained behind. And I do think one of the stories that we don't know is why Ghana decided without hesitation to leave its troops here. Dallaire could not have stayed if the Ghanaian troops had also been withdrawn. The withdrawal started by withdrawing the Belgian troops. It was a unilateral decision on behalf of the Belgian government, extremely well informed on what was happening here, and yet decided to pull out its peacekeeping force, the bulk of UNAMIR, the best trained and the best equipped, were Belgian soldiers, and they simply left.
And in a way, really to emphasize what you're saying, is that De Leer himself did say that the first thing, once he decided that he was really going to stay, in spite of the pressures on him to leave, the first thing that he needed to do was to go and ask the Ghanaians if they would stay. And it sounds as if he too was thinking, if they don't stay, I don't see much point in my staying. But apparently, from his own words, he said there was no hesitation. They just simply said yes. We still don't know why.
Yes, but I think crucial to that decision was his deputy, Lieutenant General Henry Eni Doho, who thought it absolutely outrageous that anyone could think of leaving. And I think he made his own president, Jerry Rawlings, aware of that. So I think we also must thank Henry Eni Doho for these decisions. He did not hesitate either.
And I think when you say that we should thank him, there is a lot for which to thank them for staying, especially for those people who did take refuge at the Hotel de Mille Collines, because if anybody really saved those refugees, it was the presence of Lomio De Leer and his troops at the time, including the wonderful Senegalese captain who also did his best to try and do something there.
Diagne.
Yeah, Diagne.
The famous Diagne,
yeah.
who rescued so many people, yes. The Hotel des Mille Collines was a focus of attention of the Western press right from the beginning, because there were some famous people there who had visas to leave. And the hotel was protected by a UNAPC at the gate, an armoured personnel carrier, but also by Tunisian peacekeepers, and also the lesser known peacekeeper from Poland, a military intelligence officer who was a military observer, unarmed military observer, who had helped keep the people safe. It was the UN that kept the people safe at the Hotel des Mille Collines. There's absolutely no doubt about it.
So that's a bit of the background, and I say only a bit because the background is really enormously complicated. Let's go to the main focus of your book, Intent to Deceive, which is essentially now to begin to muddy the waters and suggest people start sentences like, yes, there was just genocide, but it's more complex than that. And we'll come back to this sentence, it's more complex than that. And that is really the main subject of your book, Intent to Deceive.
The campaign to deny that the genocide was underway first emerged in the Security Council of the UN. By some accident of history, Rwanda had a non-permanent seat, voted to that non-permanent seat by the General Assembly. So the denial came firstly from the Rwandan ambassador sitting in the council, and the foundation stones of the denial campaign that we see today first emerged in the council. They then emerged in documents that came from the camps in Goma. The Hutu power ideologues sat down and planned further denial. The denial campaign then next emerges in the trials of the genocidaires at the ICTR. It is then promoted by the lawyers, some of the lawyers who acted for the genocidaires, who are still today really active. And then, of course, it emerges in the Western press. Now, at the outset, the reporting of the Western press of the genocide itself was roundly condemned in a later report. An 2018 government report found that the failure to properly report that genocide was underway, to call what was happening here tribal anarchy and chaos, in fact contributed to what was happening. I once asked the question of Sir Jeremy Greenstock, one of our great ambassadors, why Rwanda had been abandoned by the UK, and he said to me, neither the press nor the public was interested. Can you believe it?
Yes, and then
I
of
mean,
course, yeah.
it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
So the failure to adequately and properly report the 1994 genocide of the Tutsi is still with us today through, I think, a lack of care, indifference, and a complete failure to properly investigate what happened.
We'll come back. We'll come to the role of the press in a moment, but you mention it in the importance of being able to research properly and report things for what they are, as opposed, because you're mentioning now the trajectory or the progress of denial as from the perpetrators, the planners of the genocide, and the perpetrators themselves, and then all through to the lawyers, surprisingly, and then of course a lot in academia, and then down into the media. I suppose in some ways, let's try and, if possible, find a little excuse for them at the time. If you're a journalist and you're subject to deadlines, and you're going to look for information about something, and what you get is you get an awful lot of lawyers, an awful lot of academics, an awful lot of apparently august people driving a certain line. The chances are that you're going to reflect it.
No, you don't. You don't reflect it, you investigate it. Our job is to find information. We are, if you like, information hoovers. We don't make assumptions. We don't interview one person and think that they're telling us the truth. We check what they're saying. I've done hours of interviews, hundreds of interviews for my work. I don't make assumptions, and it's dangerous. Any journalist who does make assumptions is in trouble, I would suggest.
So let's stay with the press at the moment, because it hasn't changed. With a very few honorable exceptions, the reporting on Rwanda is still about assumptions, and it's still about grabbing information is being percolating through all of these areas that you've mentioned. And now, since 1994 up to where we are now, we went through a number of NGOs and even gone through human rights organizations, and it is what the press have been circulating up to now. So we still have a situation where, in spite of all the enormous amount of information, enormous amount of column inches, enormous number of hours on Rwanda, we still don't really know the actual truth of the place.
No, you don't. And I would suggest it's because Africa is less important. I would suggest you can write anything about Rwanda without checking, because different standards seem to apply. You wouldn't, for example, accuse the president of Norway or New Zealand of downing a predecessor in a jet unless you had absolutely certain, solid information to say so. This doesn't happen here.
You made this point before, and it did seem to me a really important point. And what seems even more important to me is that it hasn't seemed particularly important to everybody else. You made the point that the rules of journalism when it comes to reporting on Rwanda seem to be completely ignored. Now that is borne out by the evidence of what is reported. But what is astounding to me is that a statement like that is just ignored and people continue blithely as they were.
What am I to say to that? I mean, is it racism? Is it because it doesn't matter? I have no idea, but I do know that, let's take, for example, the claim in 1994 that there was a second genocide of Hutu, that came from a UNHCR report that was circulated widely, that persuaded the Commission of Experts of the UN that perhaps there was something in this, that persuaded Human Rights Watch that there was something in this. Well, in fact, there wasn't. I mean, if you look at that claim very carefully, as I did, if you believe it, then you are making liars of Kofi Annan, of Henry Doho, of the head of the military observers. All of them investigated these claims at the time and found them to be fraudulent. I've investigated those claims. I've spoken to an intelligence officer from Canada who was here at the time, and a unit was set up. It was absolutely extraordinary, of intelligence officers, an international group of half a dozen intelligence officers who went with a forensic scientist to investigate these claims. And they found that the bodies were old, that they dated from April and May, and that they did not date from the time that the Liberation Army, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, was coming in. Now that's investigation. That is proper investigation. It's looking at a report, it's interviewing the people who were here, it's prizing from government's information, it's looking at the US cables that have been declassified, it is interviewing people. It takes an awfully long time. But I tell you one thing I'm scared of, and that's error.
In what sense?
Well, if you make an error in a book, it's serious, because if you make one error, you lose your credibility. And that's one thing I'm scared of, so I make damn sure that my work is as correct as I can make it. And that takes a very long time.
Well, your fear doesn't seem to be shared by an awful lot of people, certainly when it comes to Rwanda. And what is interesting is that these claims, like the claims of the quote-unquote untold story, we'll come back to that sentence because it's really rather important. It's a sentence that is a tactic and a strategy from the planners of the genocide themselves to say, well, look, you may think that this is happening, but there's actually an untold story that you don't know. Now, astonishingly enough, this is picked up by, perfectly very good, well, up to then very good journalists and major broadcasting organizations like the BBC. And they use the very line, unaware that what they are doing is actually amplifying the tactic or strategy of the planners of genocide. Now, anywhere else, this would be found out very, very quickly, because these people are good. They do the work in a way that you say it ought to be done. But somehow, when it gets to Rwanda, it all falls apart. So, is it just a lack of interest? It's, after all, Rwanda suffers from what the rest of Africa suffers, which is the reporting is never really as good as it is when you report in, say, in Western countries. Or is it the apparent success of the Hutu power strategy to find a way of denying the genocide?
Were they taken in? The makers of Rwanda's untold story, yeah. Were they duped? Were they taken in by a story that they thought no one had ever found before? I don't know, but I do know that after the broadcast there was certainly cause for concern, because this documentary was soon all over the websites that were run by the deniers. And in fact, it was used in a court case in Paris in defense of Pascal Simbikangwa. It was used by the defense, yes, who had been convicted of genocide and was appealing his conviction. And in order to appeal that conviction, his lawyers asked that the BBC's untold story be shown to the jury. And I understand that there is another trial coming up in France, and the same tactic will be used. They will use this program in defense of a génocidaire. Now, you would think that our public service broadcaster would be rather concerned about this and have a close look at the program. There was a complaint that I was part of 38 people, including, interestingly, Lieutenant General Dallaire, the former president of the ICRC, ambassadors, academics, journalists, 38 people who complained to the BBC. In a long labyrinthine process, the complaint was rejected. I don't know why that was, but I do know that one day history will explain why the BBC was taken in and how this came to be and why so many years went by before the BBC finally, I hope, will admit that this was a huge mistake, this documentary.
Now, the other thing that is interesting to me is the almost capture of the lawyers that represented the genocide, as they were then suspects in the International Criminal Court for Rwanda in Arusha. Everybody deserves, or at least should have, a defense, and you expect a lawyer to fight for his or her client. But afterwards, long afterwards, and as you say, up to now, almost 30 years later, these people have actually become propagandists for the planners of genocide. This is extraordinary. I mean, it is. It's bizarre. Why? What do they find in this?
Well, I think we absolutely have to admit there's an awful lot we don't know. Why these lawyers are content to propagandize on behalf of Genocide, I have no idea. Were they taken in? Is it money? Are they being paid? We're not to know that. I hope that we do find out one day that one of these lawyers, perhaps Peter Erlinder, John Philpott, will actually explain why they have spent so many years, once they had defended their clients, why they took their clients' message out into the world as though it was the truth when it certainly was not.
Now, I wonder also whether or not, given the fact that many in positions of authority in the international community did not do what they were supposed to do. You made the interesting point that the 1994 Convention on Genocide is legally binding. So theoretically, Rwanda could actually take the Security Council to court. And so in a way, really the acceptance, the easy acceptance of nuances of genocide denial serves those who are in positions at the time. The more it'd be convenient to say, well, look, the RPF didn't do as it isn't just, it's just as bad. The RPF is maybe not as good as they must have seemed. That way you can say, well, they're all the same, and then the responsibility comes off you. So maybe that supports the genocide denial a little bit, or am I reaching out?
Well, I wish I'd done my homework, because I don't think that Rwanda can so easily take the Security Council of the United Nations to the International Court of Justice. It's not as simple as that. And in 1994, this country was starting from zero. Was the government here to put all its resources and thoughts into blaming the international community when it had a huge task on its hands? No, I don't think it's as simple as that, actually.
But it's I suppose my point is that if you're not necessarily the head of the UN, but if you're some of the officials within the UN, it's easier to point a finger at somebody else than accept that you did not do what you're supposed to do. So when some kind of line of genocide now comes on.
Now you're getting to the officials of the United Nations who were blamed. I mean, it was convenient for the governments. I think Madeleine Albright said that it was all the UN's fault, which is nonsense because it's using the UN as camouflage. But there are serious issues. You know, Boutros Ghali, who was the Secretary General at the time, was the francophone candidate for Secretary General. He had all the support of France, and in fact, when he was selected by the Council to be the next Secretary General, the second person he called, apart from his wife, was François Mitterrand, President François Mitterrand of France. And it was Boutros Ghali who prevented a lot of the information getting to the Council in April '94. This is serious. I mean, this is really, I thought that the UN should have had a proper inquiry into the role of Boutros Ghali and the senior officials that surrounded him at the time.
That really takes me back to the media and journalism, or lack thereof. Because the role of France, for instance, would have been, to this day, people will say Rwanda accuses France of complicity of having involved in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. But for a long time now, it's been beyond Rwanda accuses, because the facts are there now. You do say, if you don't know, you say Rwanda says this, and then you look for the other side. But there's so much information of how France got involved, whether you use complicit or whether you use another word, but France was certainly part of what happened in 1994. There's so much information now that anybody who's interested in finding out journalistically need not use the word Rwanda accuses anymore. They can just simply show what France did and what France didn't do. But they either choose not to because they're disinterested, or possibly something worse. I don't know.
You know how journalism works, I'm sure. I mean, what journalists tend to do is to look into the clippings of what people have said before and simply repeat it. Journalists would have to plough through the rather marvellous report by Vincent to understand exactly what happened, or they'd have to read French journalists like Jean-François Dupaquier or Patrick de Saint-Exupéry. Perhaps they can't be bothered, perhaps they haven't got time. But these journalists in the report show quite clearly the complicity that there was. Yes, I do use the word complicity. I think that is appropriate.
So, which in a way takes me back to a slight defense of a lot of journalists in the media. You're absolutely right, you should cross-check your facts, and you should investigate your facts, but very, very few do. And when it comes, so they are, in a way, I'm trying to excuse them almost for amplifying genocide denial as it is now. They may not be doing it deliberately, certainly the majority of them. They're just simply doing it because they're lazy, because they're not doing the job as it should be done.
Genocide is a specific and special crime. It is a great crime, and it needs really careful documentation. The circumstances of this are so important. So I would have thought that is a requirement for news desks and for journalists. If you are going to be looking at the crime of genocide, then you have to be absolutely certain of your facts. So perhaps it's not good enough to say that they haven't got time to read the Duclair report. If you are going to put a journalist on this story, then I think you have to know that they're going to go to the ends of the earth to try and find out what on earth happened.
It is also interesting to note that the sort of sloppiness that one finds in the reporting of the genocide in Rwanda can never be found, or rarely be found. Neither of us remember the reporting, the early reporting after the Second World War, but certainly in what we remember, what we know now, it would be unheard of to find that kind of sloppy reporting about the Holocaust, for instance. So people do their work, and they do their research. So somehow it tends to be rather offhand when it comes to the genocide in Rwanda.
Yeah, well, it gets us back to a question you asked me a long time ago. This is Africa, it's Rwanda. Perhaps it doesn't matter to people. Perhaps they are really indifferent. I still find that profoundly shocking. It's terrible when you think about it, that there isn't the same rigour when reporting this story as there is, for example, when reporting Srebrenica. You know, the reporting on Srebrenica has been widespread, it's detailed, the reports are considered. It's not the same here.
Now, from your work as a journalist, of course, but also, as I say, it almost veered into a research very, very quickly. I mean, you had to do an awful lot of digging at the UN Security Council, for instance, and 3 books demands an awful lot of work, and as you rightly say, you can't afford to get bits here wrong, because that will destroy an awful lot of really good work. People tend to ignore the other really good work and look at the little bit that you got wrong. Certainly those whose interest it is to twist the truth when we're talking about genocide denial. So you followed, as I said earlier, this progress of genocide denial. The depth of it is really quite something. It is a deep thing, and it is now being picked up by the media, which is, as we pointed out, rarely going to put the work that they should be putting into it and follow their own procedures to find out. So what are the chances that this isn't going to take root and replace the truth?
Some years ago in France, the denial was like a tsunami, like we have in the UK now. And it was through hard work, it was through the Vincent Declaire report, through Jean-François Dupaquier, Patrick de Saint-Exupéry and others that really worked hard to dig the complicity, to dig it out, to find out exactly what happened and the role of France, to hold the French government accountable. Now this has not occurred in the UK. There's very little interest. There's more interest, as I said at the time, in former Yugoslavia and Srebrenica. But I do think one day it will turn round. You know, I'm not a pessimist. I do believe that truth can pass through fire and not get burned, as you say here. That the truth will out, that it needs more work, it needs more people to come, and perhaps, you know, more declassified documents in the US. We've hardly declassified anything at all concerning this in the UK, so that work still needs to be done. There's an awful lot more that needs to be done to properly explain this and to provide an account to the British people. They deserve to know what their government is saying in the Security Council on their behalf. You know, the Charter of the UN begins with "we the people," so we the peoples must hold our governments responsible. The president of the council at the time, Colin Keating, thought that every government on the council in 1994 should hold an inquiry into its own policies, into how it got it so wrong, but that never happened.
What is interesting is that I think we have to live with the fact that something like this happening on the African continent is never going to be as properly investigated as if it happened in Europe or the Americas. And in fact, really, the dogged work of people like you and the others that you mentioned, in a way, we've got further than what normally would have expected. But what is interesting about the UK is that we've got these 5 genocide suspects that are really still avoiding going their day in court on technicalities. You mentioned them in your book, and for anybody who has read your book, and it's quite good detail, you outline it as it happened, and it's clear you don't have to be a lawyer to know that they're getting away on technicalities, but they're also spending an awful lot of money because they're getting legal aid and they're using very expensive barristers. One would have thought that the British media might have been interested in this, but apparently not, you know. And one of the shocking things also in your book is that one of the reasons given by the courts is that, look, you know, to be able to try this case properly would involve an awful lot of work, and we've already got an awful lot of on our plate. So that seems to me to be particularly shocking, and of course it would never be even intimated if it came to something like the Holocaust, for instance.
The 5 alleged genocidaires who walk our streets, who are living on taxpayer money, who are getting legal aid in their own defence, are supported by some really strange people. I don't know whether you know, but Paul Rusesabagina came to London in 2008.
Yeah.
to try to prevent the extradition of these 5, and the magistrate realised very quickly that Rusindana was no more than a proponent of the Hutu power movement. Although he denied in court that he knew these men at all, they were warmly greeted as he walked into the court. So they do have their defenders, and whether or not one day they will be extradited here, I don't know. But what I think really the best would be is if they're put on trial in the UK. I don't think people in the UK have got a clue really about what happened here. And that's profoundly shocking. We're not, as I say, Norway or New Zealand. We're a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and that brings special responsibilities, and we should actually be holding our politicians to account for those decisions. And I think had we done so, then those 5 would not be free today. There has to be some movement on this case. There has to be.
What is interesting, again, reading the very clear outline in your book, is that the courts themselves more or less acknowledge that there is a case to answer here, but it simply can't go on because of this or that other technicality. So the politics can't, of course, and shouldn't interfere in the courts. But in a way, I wonder whether or not it does anyway, because I cannot imagine, say, somebody accused of involvement in the Holocaust finding their way out of the court system, out of the justice system, on these technicalities, and it would be politically untenable. But this is possible. So I wonder the extent to which the politics can and do interfere in this anyway.
Well, let's look at the Holocaust, where people who are 90 are being put on trial. There is no place to hide, it would seem to me, for the perpetrators of the Holocaust in Europe, and yet the opposite is true here. But I take objection to your description of it being technicality. It's not a technicality. The reason why the 5 are not extradited here is the claim that they would not get a fair trial, in which case I wonder why the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, has extradited cases here. Other European countries who have had alleged genocidaire caught in their country have extradited genocidaire here. We are an outlier in this, and I cannot understand why that is.
Let's go back, as we come towards the end, let's go back to the area that you know even better. Let's go back to journalism. As I say, the amount of work you've had to do writing 3 books on different subjects, but pretty much overall it is about Rwanda, and then your latest book on Intent to Deceive gives you a pretty good understanding of the nature of genocide denial, and your journalism, your understanding of journalism gives you a pretty good grounding on understand how this is covered. Starting with the UK, but generally, with the UK in particular, where do we go from here? People are still reporting things that you look at and you think they're actually talking about an entirely different country that isn't Rwanda. It's mentioned as Rwanda, but this is not Rwanda. Where do we go from here? How does it change?
That's a very difficult question. Let's go firstly to the 3 books. A People Betrayed was about the role of the West, what happened at the UN and in each individual government departments, how Rwanda was betrayed, how the people were betrayed. The second book, Conspiracy to Murder, described how this great crime was planned, how it was paid for, how it was organized, how it was perpetrated. I think that's a very important book, actually, because I don't think people are aware of the detailed planning that went into this. This was a planned political campaign, it is clear. It was after that book was published that I began to realize that denial was spreading like wildfire. It was extraordinary to me that, having established the facts, that they should be so denied. I will never forget watching Rwanda's Untold Story. At the end of that program, I was profoundly shocked, and I realized what a mountain there was to climb to try to put the record straight. This was not spontaneous. There was no second genocide. And if you report on the assassination of a president, on what was a coup d'etat, then you cannot rely on two exiles who are corrupt and who left this country under a cloud. You have to take account of the scientific evidence, of the witnesses who were here. You cannot just simply dismiss this as, what was it, you know, that the Rwandan Patriotic Front brought this catastrophe upon the Tutsi of Rwanda? That's absolute nonsense. And I still get cross when I hear it to this day. So the work continues. I will write letters. I will campaign. I will try to persuade people of the truth of this case. I hope my books sell. They're not published by big publishers who can afford huge publicity events, but they stand, and I stand by them, and I stand by the work that I've done, and I will continue to work on it. Yes, I will.
In a way, really, Genocide in Io, and in a sense, your book on the how the genocide was planned is very germane to your latest book, Intended to Deceive, because of course the one thing that Genocide in Eyes will start off is by denying any plan, and we hear a lot about this is amplified a lot in journalism, and people writing about yes, but the RPF may have started it. Now, the people that say that, what I find odd is that there is a bizarre notion that the genocide ideology, the genocide, we say the 1994 genocide against Tutsi, but actually we could say the genocide against the Tutsi, because it started long before 94. In a way, it goes back even before, the ideology goes back before the 50s. So to those who suggest that somehow the 1990 beginning of the liberation war, the RPF liberation war, had something to do with the genocide ideology, well, what brought on the earlier ideology?
What journalists forget, and what I don't think has enough attention nowadays, is the racist apartheid regime that existed in this country before it was liberated by the Rwandan Patriotic Army. A quota system for a minority, a quota system that determined how many Tutsi could have education or jobs or go abroad. I mean, this was an odious system, like the apartheid system in South Africa, and how extraordinary it is that that anti-apartheid system in South Africa should end with elections in 1994 at the same time that the genocide against the Tutsi was happening here. Journalists need to go back. They need to understand why this country was liberated in the first place.
Fundamentally, it's difficult to say in the case of Rwanda, but one can say that journalism in Britain has got reason to say we do our job well. And the BBC can boast to be, with some justification, one of the major broadcasting organizations in the world that does its job well. And there's some wonderful journalists within the BBC and one journalist within the UK. How does one, is it possible at all, how does one appeal to that and say, you're actually not letting Rwanda down necessarily, you're letting yourself down?
Well, you know, the BBC can't produce brilliant journalism all the time. You know, no organisation is perfect. You know, we don't have a monopoly on that at all. So, no, I don't think you can sort of dismiss the BBC, the public service broadcaster, for this one programme. I think what we have to do is try to find out who inspired it. I mean, how on earth did it come to be made? Who suggested to Jane Corbin, the journalist, that she should come here, try to confuse everybody about what she was doing, and then write an untold story that wasn't untold at all, because it had been told by the perpetrators in their trials at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So you can't dismiss the whole organisation. I do take issue with you, though, about British journalism. My third book was called The End of the Street, and it was about Rupert Murdoch, and it was about how he outmanoeuvred our print unions. And there is a line in that book that I wrote, that Rupert Murdoch had poisoned the world of Fleet Street journalism. And if you look at our newspapers today, you can see what's happened. Have you read The Sun and the Daily Express and the Daily Mail? I mean, we're in trouble here, you know, with our journalism. I used to work on the Sunday Times. It was a golden age. We had an editor called Harry Evans, and, you know, it was a very good training, and I'm eternally grateful. I'm very proud still that I worked on that paper.
You see, I mean, they still do, not so much now. You used to have, you have the tabloids, and you had what they call the quality papers, the broadsheets. I mean, it would be invidious to mention names, but what I find astonishing now is that you find a little bit more sententiously, a little longer, and so on, but you find almost the exact same thing that you'd find in the tabloids in what used to be called the quality papers. And you expected some people to be embarrassed about that kind of journalism, and you know, you expect the news editor to say, we can't have this. And some of the things that we had about Rwanda in some of these papers, it is not possible that those kinds of journalists can look at it and not know that it's not really telling the story as it should be told.
No, it is. It's profoundly shocking that some of these papers are writing things with no checking and no thought at all as to who is behind it. I find it really extraordinary.
So in a way, really, well, back to the question, what happens? What does one do? Is there, other than individuals like you doing the letters, doing your work as you do, is there broadly, how does one challenge people not to necessarily, I mean, really all Rwanda is looking for is not looking for anybody to speak for Rwanda. Rwanda is looking for journalism, which it hasn't had. So Rwanda is looking for decent journalism. How do we get people in the UK especially who still believe in the quality of their journalism, even you know, notwithstanding the points that you've just made, which, by the way, have been made by a lot of other you know, senior journalists in the UK. But nevertheless, they think there is something to preserve here. How does one challenge them and say, look, you know, you may not care about Rwanda, but if you care about your journalism, this stuff has got to change?
Has to, but I cannot answer your question. That's you're ending with the most impossible question of all. I can only play my own role, and I can only do my best. And there will be an event, something will happen. You can't keep this under wraps forever. There will be information that will come out, I'm absolutely sure, that will turn this tide, this tsunami of disinformation and fake news that surrounds this country.
Let's end with your book. There is new details might emerge. People will find denial in different ways. But to date, it is very difficult to find any tactic or strategy of denial that you haven't covered in Intent to Deceive. So what would you say is, in a way, who should read it the most? I mean, you're a writer, so therefore you want everybody to read it. But if you had to choose...
journalists, they should read it. Yes. I want journalists to read it. Journalists who cover Rwanda,
yeah.
who write about Rwanda should read it, yes. Yeah. I think so. I hope so.
Yeah. So let's talk about your next work. What are you doing now and what are you going to do?
I'd like to update Intent to Deceive. It's only at the moment in hardback. I'd like to do a paperback because an awful lot has happened. It was published in February 2020. This is a delayed launch because of COVID. And I do have a pile of information on my desk that really needs to go into that book, so I hope to be doing that next. But that depends on the publisher. You know, publishers aren't over keen on books that take a long time to do and won't sell many copies. So the more people who buy it, the better it is for me, because it will give me a chance to do a paperback.
Okay, well, I hope they're listening, and once you do a paperback, please come back and talk to us.
Thank you very much,
Linda,
Vincent.
thank you very much indeed for your time.
Bye.